hundreds of millions of downloads and streams a month.
It's wild.
In an era where there are over 5 million podcasts on Spotify, Alex Cooper's Call Her Daddy podcast has been proclaimed as the most listened to podcast by women on Spotify.
I would say that it is the most listened to female podcast in the world.
The explanation in my mind of what is going on or what has happened with Call Her Daddy.
So what transpired for Alex Cooper and the Call Her Daddy brand to become one of a few coveted Spotify original exclusive podcasts?
The podcast literally blew up. I mean, you guys all know it was like, whoa.
Especially in an era where listeners are overwhelmed with the amount of podcast content that exists on the internet. What makes this podcast so special?
I don't think that anyone has the relationship they have with their audience the way that I do.
This podcast is called Call Her Daddy. If you want to on a first date,
How to get out of the friend zone. You need to stop being her little...
I really like how conversational your podcast is.
No, what if he knew my password?
Why the f*** would he know your password?
Okay, no.
Wait, hold on.
you gotta be prepared to never hear from this guy ever again.
We had no idea how big it was going to get and how fast it was going to grow.
And what led to Alex Cooper signing a whopping $60 million deal with Spotify in 2021.
The rest is so much history. Alex got this huge deal. She's killing it.
We really respect what you did in the past, but pitch us what's the future, because that's why we're signing you.
How can a podcast about these women's takes and experiences on popular culture and hookup culture shift the industry's view on podcasting so strongly that it rivals only Joe Rogan as a top 10 podcast? Unless there was a method to the madness and a certain obsessiveness and passion that makes this podcast unique.
Everything you see is not always what it actually is.
No, yeah, exactly.
Did you experience anxiety prior to fame?
For sure.
There's certainly more here than what meets the eye. In this video, we will discuss the current host and former co-host fan loyalty, strength of their on-air personalities, relatability, talent, the power of therapy, and also what this says about podcasting as a whole, and what aspiring podcasters can learn from Alex Cooper. Stay tuned.
We're insane.
The start of Call Her Daddy began in 2018 when two roommates, Alex Cooper and Sophia Franklin, had the brilliant idea of starting a podcast. Despite only knowing each other for 6 months prior to starting the podcast, the two of them had a likable chemistry and a ridiculous amount of everyday life content that translated into captivating storytelling. With Cooper coming from a film and content creation background, she knew exactly how the podcast could translate their everyday lives and be a relatable forum for others who had similar experiences. Cooper structured the show to grasp the diminishing attention spans of her millennial and Generation Z audience. Even though the duo and their growing audience enjoyed the podcast, there's no way that they could even guess how fast things were about to take off.
Sophie and I were confident, but we had no idea what we were doing.
Definitely are really embarrassingly open about it.
Yeah.
And that's what this whole podcast is about.
Live, laugh, love.
So thank you.
After only 4 episodes, Cooper recalls receiving a DM from the owner of Barstool Sports, Dave Portnoy. He was blown away by the sizzle reel of the podcast that Cooper made and wanted to sign her podcast to his network immediately. The initial Barstool contract was for a 3-year deal. First year was for $75,000 each. Second year, $85,000, with the third year being $100,000. And due to the podcast exploding the way it did, they obviously had a lot of leverage quickly, leading to a lucrative renegotiation. For years, I knew of the podcast's success, but I didn't quite get the appeal of it. Once I delved into it some more, I learned very quickly why it became so big. It's no secret how Alex and Sophia built this trust and loyalty with their audience. It's because they weren't afraid to share stories of their life that made them look crazy. Sometimes we have to go there because 9 times out of 10, somebody can relate.
What does out crazy mean? I had dated this guy. I knew he was being shady. I knew he was probably fucking around, which was fine because I was doing the same thing. Don't fucking share with someone all the deep, dark holes of your past all the time. They don't need to know that, especially if you're trying to pursue this person dating. Sometimes I think people feel like it's so good to be open and honest, but you have to be aware that there are some situations that need to be kept to yourself.
All right. So I go into jail. They put me in an actual jail cell. They say I'm going to be in there for a few days.
There's this balance of empowerment and a lack of discernment. And I gather that balance is the appeal. And the recurring lessons of these stories is that they don't have their shit figured out. And neither do we. We are all just winging it and figuring it out as we go along. And that right there is the beauty of the struggle and the birth of an honest and successful podcast.
This is why our podcast is because we give guys perfect advice of how to fuck with a girl, and then we're telling girls how to fuck back.
The duo weren't the only ones in unfamiliar territory. The podcasting industry as a whole was also in unfamiliar territory. But the good news for the podcast was they were the exact podcast that a large audience was looking to sink its teeth into. And the timing couldn't have been more perfect. See, at the time,
every company that's done exclusive deals, they're pretty much all stopping. If you're not Joe Rogan or probably Call Her Daddy, you're not getting an exclusive deal.
Listen up.
although a plethora of podcasts had existed prior to Call Her Daddy, few at the time had been able to appeal to a very specific millennial and Generation Z demographic. I believe that what Dave Portnoy saw early in Alex and Sophia with Call Her Daddy is what the rest of the industry will be searching for, especially Spotify.
Call Her Daddy, Alex Cooper, we saw a sizzle reel that she made. I'd never seen anything like the sizzle reel. And she sat down, I'm like, who made this for you? And she's like, I did. I learned how to edit it. I did all of it. We just hired her on the spot when she said that. She said, oh, by the way, I do it with another girl. I'm bringing her with me.
There was a need in the market for a charismatic and concise video podcast format. Most podcasts at the time were audio only. They lacked the engagement of a dedicated audience, and most importantly, were not structured to be consumed by a younger audience. When Spotify had its eyes set on the podcasting market, they paid attention to the audience Barstool and Call Her Daddy and the Joe Rogan podcast were garnering, and the company decided to gamble big. Spotify invested $1 billion into the podcast market with the promise to generate $100 billion by 2030, and Spotify has already lost $500 million since making that investment. The problem is, podcasting is a very hard business to make profitable on its own. The business relies on the strength and loyalty of your audience, which Call Her Daddy has. And that's why a fight over, say, an IP and merchandising sales is so important. I want you to keep this in mind as we go forward. It has a lot to do with foreshadowing the future of this podcast. Where are we again? That's right, renegotiation time.
We had a very famous meeting on the roof deck of where I lived. It was Alex and Sophia.
They say there's always three sides to a story. In this case, Alex, Sophia, and Dave Portnoy's accounts of Call Her Daddy's renegotiation period describes a very tumultuous yet insightful experience into the business of podcasting on the highest level. According to Rolling Stone's article of the podcast, Sophia recalls when they were approached to bring their podcast to Barstool in 2018. Sophia, who was making $40,000 at the time, felt it was a no-brainer to leave her job to podcast full-time with Alex and Barstool. She had no idea about who she was going into business with, and I don't necessarily blame her for this. Who could really predict this project that these two 20-year-old women started as a hobby would explode like this?
Oh, we're doing
One more. Okay, the next one is my girlfriend of 4 years never sucks my dick or makes me come. Wish I do.
Cheat on her.
No, look.
During 2020, it was time for the rising podcasters to renegotiate their deal. At this time, all parties were delighted to. However, this relationship would soon become rocky. Fallouts over money, I suppose, right?
The explanation in my mind of what is going on or what has happened with Call Her Daddy.
According to Rolling Stone, the way that Sophia saw it, she was just like every other woman who works for a business that tries to get a raise. The narrative that was circulating at the time was that Sophia was shopping the podcast around to other media companies with her then boyfriend, HBO Sports Executive Vice President Peter Nelson. After an intense back and forth figuring out how both parties can seal the deal, Portnoy offered Sophia and Alex $500,000 and the intellectual property of the podcast.
And I basically shortened their contract and agreed, I'll give you guys the IP. You guys just work one more year.
Which pleased Alex. Sophia, on the other hand, thought they were being lowballed.
But we could just so tell, like, oh wow, we both took that meeting very differently.
Sophia instead wanted $1 million for her and Alex with the increase in bonuses and the sales of the merchandise. Sophia understood that keeping the IP of the podcast was great, but not at the expense of a larger slice of the revenue. According to Sophia, her request was appropriate considering the podcast was generating $11 million per year at the time. This podcast was built off of their storytelling and creativity, and Sophia felt that this money was rightfully owed to them. And to be honest, I don't blame her. Sophia mistrusted Dave and Barstool and felt the duo was being lowballed because of their gender. Sophia stated, "You think misogyny or sexism or unfair pay won't affect you, and speaking up and voicing your opinion won't affect you, but it affects every woman. Alex felt that she appeased all of Sophia's requests and was feeling that she was being pulled in directions that wasn't sustainable.
Why are you so willing to abandon the Call Her Daddy brand to go start something new? Why am I feeling like there's a lot of sabotaging going on so that the deal is off the table and I'm forced to go start a new show?
Sophia wanted to leave Barstool with Alex and take the IP with them. With an ongoing dispute active with no resolution in sight, Portnoy's patience grew thin and he gave the duo an ultimatum.
Sophia said, Alex, I hate this deal. What it comes down to is you don't want to leave and I don't want to stay.
So I called both Sophia and Alex. I said, we're going to do a deal with Alex. Sophia, you come or you don't come, but we're moving forward.
Alex feared that Sophia was purposely trying to sabotage the podcast and the brand, so she gave in and resigned to Barstool with Sophia out of the picture. As you know, Sophia has her own show now, and as she adjusts to a new chapter in her life, she still doesn't regret her experience, which is a mature thing to say. I would, however, think that she'd have liked to do things differently, but I obviously cannot speak for her. Sophia hasn't talked to Alex since the split. As far as Alex goes,
everything I try to tell anyone that listens to this podcast, I'm like, you belong to yourself and you can do whatever the fuck you want. After the split, Alex continued to record the podcast under Barstool until June of 2021. She then took Call Her Daddy to Spotify for a $60 million 3-year deal. Dave Portnoy, who is still involved in the merchandising of Call Her Daddy podcast, says that Barstool could have competed with Spotify for this deal, but financially, it would have been a big risk. Spotify signing Alex to a $60 million deal in essentially a business that's hardly profitable could mean that Alex's audience and her growth will be one of the dominoes to fall in Spotify's direction towards not just being profitable, but dominating this multimedia space. With her growing success, Alex decided to use her platform to touch on more topics surrounding mental health.
Even you saying it's interesting, like it affected your art, I'm interested to know, how did it affect your personal relationships with this theme of abandonment within you?
It affected them.
Because if you are not doing the introspective work and being like, okay, why am I so triggered? Why do I have these trust issues? Why am I always lashing out at him when he does XYZ? If you can be working on yourself every week, then you'll catch yourself being like, oh, I wrote about this. No.
The interviewing of music artists is what pulled me in, and from that different style of content, I saw Alex's content from a different perspective.